beneath banners, long before kingdoms rose and collapsed beneath fire and iron, long before battlefields carried the names of heroes and tragedies. War already existed, not as armies, not as conquest, not as strategy, but as something deeper, something older, conflict, the force that emerges whenever desire collides with desire, whenever pride refuses surrender, whenever power reaches toward power. Even in the earliest days of existence, the universe itself had been shaped through struggle. Primordial forces fought for dominion. The Titans rose against those before them, and eventually the heavens themselves trembled beneath the fury of divine war. By the time the Olympians stood victorious upon the heights of the world, peace had finally arrived, or at least something resembling peace. The great wars had ended. The sky belonged to Zeus, the seas to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades. Olympus glittered above creation with divine certainty. For the first time, the cosmos seemed structured, ordered, controlled. And yet, beneath this fragile calm, something remained unresolved. Because peace after conflict often carries the memory of violence within it, like embers hidden beneath ash, waiting, silent, unseen. Among the gods of Olympus, many represented ideals civilization admired: wisdom, beauty, justice, light, music, harvest, craftsmanship. But there existed another force woven through existence that no one wished to celebrate openly. A force every god understood. A force every creature would eventually encounter. Violence itself. Not defense. Not noble warfare. Not strategic battle. Something more instinctive. The surge of anger before thought intervenes. The moment restraint collapses. The heat that rises behind the eyes when reason begins to disappear. And from this truth came the birth of Ares, born to Zeus and Hera, child of kings, an Olympian from the moment of his existence. Yet from the beginning there was something unusual surrounding him. Many gods entered the world beneath signs of wonder. Apollo arrived with light, Athena with wisdom. Others brought beauty or prophecy or order. But around Ares there was tension, not visible, not spoken, felt, like distant thunder gathering beyond the horizon. Olympus itself seemed uncertain, as though the heavens recognized a truth before words could form around it. For Ares was not born to represent what gods admired. He represented what they feared within themselves, because even divine beings were not strangers to rage. The child grew beneath golden halls, the skies. He stood among immortals, walked beside powers that shaped reality itself. And yet there was always a distance surrounding him, not exile, not rejection, not yet. Something quieter, something harder to define. The other gods understood instinctively that Ares felt different, not weaker, not lesser, simply unsettling. Because there are forces one accepts and forces one tolerates. No one fears music, no one fears harvests, but conflict changes every room it enters. Even before Ares fully understood himself, tension followed his presence. Arguments seemed sharper around him, silence heavier, emotions stronger, as though war itself had not merely arrived in Olympus, as though Olympus had become aware that war now possessed consciousness. As the young god wandered through the halls of the heavens, he observed his siblings carefully. Apollo carried beauty effortlessly. Others inspired admiration without effort. Even those feared by mortals often carried purpose easily upon their shoulders. But Ares felt something else, something difficult to name: distance. He watched laughter gather around others, watched conversations unfold naturally, watched bonds form with ease. Yet whenever he approached, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible. Conversations shortened, silences stretched, eyes moved elsewhere. No one openly explained why. Perhaps they themselves did not understand. Because how does one explain discomfort around a force older than civilization itself? War had entered Olympus. But unlike the other gods, war did not arrive carrying gifts. It arrived carrying possibility. The possibility that harmony could break. The possibility that peace might never fully remain. And perhaps somewhere deep within themselves, even the gods understood a truth they would never willingly speak aloud. Conflict is necessary. History moves through it. Kingdoms are born through it. Power rises because of it. But no one truly loves it. Not even those who create it. As ages passed and Ares grew stronger, the feeling surrounding him remained unchanged, because his nature was becoming clearer. He was not battle-guided by wisdom, not courage, not honor. Those ideas would belong elsewhere. Ares represented something more raw, something more human. The violence beneath thought itself, the instinct to strike before understanding, the storm before reflection. And Olympus began to realize something unsettling. War was no longer an event, no longer a circumstance, no longer a consequence. Now it had a face. Now it had a voice. Now it walked among the gods. And from the highest halls of heaven, beneath skies that had only recently learned peace, the immortals slowly began to understand. War itself had been born. As ages passed across the heavens, Olympus continued to grow into the center of divine order. Its halls shone above the world like a kingdom untouched by uncertainty. Golden pillars rose toward endless skies. Clouds drifted beneath marble bridges. Music echoed through vast chambers where immortals gathered beneath light that never seemed to fade. To mortals below, Olympus would one day appear perfect, the dwelling place of gods, a realm beyond suffering, beyond weakness, beyond the imperfections of the world beneath it. But perfection often appears strongest from a distance. Even among immortals, peace carried fractures hidden beneath its surface. Jealousy existed there. Pride existed there. Resentment lived quietly beneath smiles and ceremonies. The gods governed existence, yet they remained deeply shaped by emotion. And among them moved Ares, older now, stronger, no longer merely the child born beneath uneasy silence. He had become power given form, and with every passing age, Olympus felt his presence more clearly, not because Ares demanded attention, not because he sought admiration, but because some forces alter the atmosphere around them simply by existing. A storm does not announce itself. The air changes first. Pressure shifts. The world senses something approaching long before thunder arrives. Ares carried that same feeling. Wherever he walked, emotions seemed heavier. Arguments sharpened. Pride surfaced more quickly. Minor disagreements grew larger than they should. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice directly, yet the gods felt it, even if none spoke openly about it, because Ares represented something they wished to believe stood beneath them. Conflict, impulse, violence, the things civilization attempts to master. But Olympus itself had only risen through war. The Titans had not surrendered peacefully. Order had not emerged gently. Everything the gods ruled had been shaped through struggle, and Ares embodied the truth hidden beneath their victories. That violence often stands at the beginning of every kingdom. Perhaps that was why the gods struggled around him, because he reminded them of something uncomfortable, not what they wished to become, but what they had been. Among his siblings, Ares observed differences constantly. Apollo moved through Olympus effortlessly. Light seemed to gather around him. Music followed him. The gods admired beauty because beauty made existence easier. Others commanded respect through wisdom, through craftsmanship, through skill. Each possessed a purpose civilization could celebrate openly. But Ares looked upon himself and found uncertainty. What exactly was his place? What role did violence serve once peace had been established? The question followed him through endless years, because war itself becomes difficult to understand during peace. Necessary once, unwanted afterward. And slowly Ares began noticing something else. The distance surrounding him had not disappeared. It had simply become quieter, more polite. The The gods welcomed him among feasts. They stood beside him during ceremonies. They acknowledged his place upon Olympus. Yet there remained invisible boundaries around him. Subtle hesitations, small pauses in conversation, a silence that arrived and disappeared too quickly to explain. He belonged, yet somehow he did not. And perhaps this wounded Ares more than anger ever could, because rejection from enemies is expected. Distance from family feels different. Immortality makes such feelings heavier. Years do not pass. Time does not heal. Emotion remains, accumulating slowly across centuries. Olympus accepted Ares because he was one of them. But acceptance is not affection, and Ares increasingly understood the difference. Far below Olympus, the mortal world continued changing. Civilizations rose, cities expanded, kings built walls and gathered armies. Humanity itself grew increasingly familiar with conflict. And as war spread among mortals, something strange began to happen. Prayers began reaching Olympus, not for peace, not always. Sometimes men prayed for victory, sometimes conquest, sometimes destruction upon enemies. And though they feared war, they called upon its God when they believed violence might benefit them. Ares listened, silently. For the first time, he felt something unexpected. Recognition. Mortals feared him, but they needed him too. Even while despising conflict, they repeatedly created it, again and again, generation after generation. And perhaps nowhere did Ares see himself reflected more clearly than in humanity, because mortals often hated what they could not stop becoming. The gods of Olympus looked toward ideals, toward perfection, toward order. But mortals understood rage. They understood impulse. They understood moments when emotion overpowered reason. Because unlike gods, mortals lived within uncertainty every day. And uncertainty breeds conflict. As these thoughts settled into Ares, something shifted within him. Not peace, not understanding, something colder, a realization. He had spent centuries asking why Olympus kept distance from him, why discomfort followed him through halls of gold. But perhaps he had been asking the wrong question entirely, because the gods did not fear Ares himself. They feared what he represented. For war had entered Olympus, and now Olympus could no longer pretend itself untouched by violence, because violence had always lived there. Ares merely gave it a face. Among all the gods who walked the halls of Olympus, none stood in sharper contrast to Ares than Athena. Both were connected to war. Both carried influence over battle. Both would one day stand beside armies and shape the outcome of human conflict. And yet they represented entirely different truths. To mortals below, this difference would become one of the oldest contradictions in mythology. Because war itself possesses two faces. One thinks, the other reacts. One plans, the other strikes. One seeks victory, the other seeks release. Athena embodied the first, Ares embodied the second. From the moment she emerged into Olympus, Athena seemed destined for admiration. She had not entered the world through ordinary birth. She emerged fully formed from the mind of Zeus himself, clothed in armor, armed, wise. Even her arrival carried symbolism, thought becoming power, reason becoming force. The gods looked upon her with fascination, because Athena represented something they deeply valued: control, discipline, order shaped through intelligence. And unlike Ares, she wore warfare without discomfort. To Olympus, hers was a version of battle that could be celebrated. Not rage, not bloodlust. Strategy, purpose. Civilization often prefers violence when it appears organized. Ares noticed this immediately, not through words. No one openly declared preference. Olympus rarely functioned through direct cruelty. Distance there moved quietly, subtly, like shifting wind. But Ares observed the way conversations gathered around Athena. He saw how admiration followed her naturally. He watched respect arrive before she even spoke. And slowly, an uncomfortable realization formed within him. They were both connected to war, yet only one inspired pride. The rivalry between them did not begin with shouting, not with battles, not with declarations. It began with comparison. The oldest source of conflict, Ares saw Athena standing beneath sunlight, while wisdom seemed to move effortlessly around her. Mortals would build cities in her honor. Kings would pray for her guidance. Generals would invoke her name before war. Not because she promised violence, because she promised victory. There is a difference, and Ares felt it, because mortals rarely worship war itself. They worship triumph. One evening across the halls of Olympus, as gods gathered beneath endless skies, Ares watched from a distance. Laughter moved through marble chambers. Golden light reflected against polished stone. The atmosphere felt effortless, yet Ares remained apart, not physically, emotionally. And across the hall stood Athena, calm, measured, composed. Everything Ares was not. Everything Ares believed others wished he could become. The realization unsettled him more than anger ever had, because rage at least possesses direction. Jealousy spreads differently, quietly, slowly, without announcing itself. For centuries, Ares had questioned why discomfort followed him. Now he wondered something else. Had Olympus simply chosen a different version of war, a version easier to admire? Because Athena fought with calculation, Ares fought with instinct. Athena represented war controlled by thought. Ares represented what happened when thought disappeared entirely. And perhaps the gods found one easier to accept because one felt safer. Yet battlefields below told a different story. Far beneath Olympus, mortals marched toward conflict, carrying both gods with them. Generals prayed to Athena, soldiers prayed to Ares, kings sought wisdom, warriors sought courage born from fury, because reality itself understood what Olympus preferred to ignore. No war had ever belonged entirely to reason. No battle had ever remained perfectly controlled. Even strategy eventually meets panic. Even discipline eventually encounters rage. And in those moments, Ares waited. Not because chaos always wins, but because instinct remains older than logic, older than planning, older than civilization itself. Still, the rivalry deepened, not always through open hostility, sometimes through silence, sometimes through glances, sometimes through victories measured not on battlefields, but in admiration. Athena stood as proof that war could appear noble. Ares stood as reminder that beneath every noble cause there remained blood, fear, violence, and loss. Olympus loved ideals, but Ares increasingly wondered whether ideals existed only because gods feared what lay beneath them. Because beneath every strategy rests conflict, and beneath every conflict rests emotion. No army marches purely through reason. No kingdom fights without anger. No mortal enters battle untouched by fear. Ares knew this. Perhaps Athena knew it too. But neither could escape what they represented. And slowly, Ares began understanding something painful. The rivalry between them was never truly about war. It was about acceptance, because one side of conflict becomes remembered in monuments. The other becomes buried beneath them. Time moved differently upon Olympus. For mortals, years passed like falling sand. Kingdoms rose and vanished. Heroes lived and died. Entire civilizations disappeared beneath history. But for gods, time stretched endlessly, and endless time can make distance feel heavier. For Ares, distance had become familiar, not hatred, not exile, something quieter, something harder to confront. He stood among the Olympians, sat beside them in feasts, walked the same halls beneath endless skies. Yet there remained invisible space around him, a subtle separation no one acknowledged. No one rejected him openly. No one denied his place. But acceptance is not affection, and Ares increasingly understood the difference. He was the son of Zeus and Hera, a god among gods, equal by blood, equal by birth. Yet even among family, some truths remain difficult to embrace, because Ares represented something Olympus never fully trusted. Conflict. Not noble warfare, not heroic struggle, something deeper, something more instinctive, the force that rises before thought, the surge of anger before reason intervenes, violence stripped of explanation, and even Zeus seemed uneasy with it. The king of Olympus valued order, structure, authority, peace beneath his rule. The world had already endured wars against the Titans. The heavens had already known chaos. Zeus wanted stability, but Ares embodied something that could never remain controlled forever. War does not obey borders. Violence does not remain where rulers place it. Once unleashed, conflict develops its own direction. Perhaps that was why Zeus often spoke harshly toward him. Ancient stories tell of moments where Zeus criticized Ares more severely than many other gods. Not because Ares lacked strength, not because he lacked courage, but because he lacked restraint. To Zeus, Ares often seemed like force without control, power driven by emotion, and those judgments lingered, because criticism from enemies passes quickly. Criticism from fathers remains. As centuries moved across Olympus, Ares watched the other gods carefully. He watched admiration gather naturally around Apollo. He watched wisdom follow Athena. Others inspired joy, respect, wonder. They represented ideals, things civilization wanted to celebrate. But war rarely receives celebration, only necessity. Far below Olympus, humanity continued changing. Cities rose, armies gathered, kings built empires through ambition and fear, and wherever conflict appeared, prayers followed. Not always prayers for peace. Many prayed for victory, for conquest, for strength. Some called upon Ares. At first he listened with curiosity, then slowly, something else. Recognition. Because mortals understood emotions, Olympus preferred to hide. Fear, rage, desperation, survival. Humans lived close to uncertainty, and uncertainty often creates conflict. Again and again, Ares watched mortals condemn violence, then create it. He watched rulers speak of peace while preparing war, watched men fear bloodshed while marching toward battle, and slowly he understood something painful. Olympus feared what he represented. Humanity reflected it, because beneath civilization, beneath law, beneath reason itself, conflict remained, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but always present. One evening Ares stood alone at the edge of Olympus. Clouds drifted beneath his feet. Stars stretched endlessly overhead. Far below, the world turned silently in darkness, and for a long time he simply watched. Because after endless centuries, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The world would always need war. Kingdoms would rise through it. History would move because of it. Mortals would summon it again and again. But needing something and loving something are not the same. And perhaps that was Ares's burden, not hatred, not rejection, something quieter, to be necessary, yet never truly wanted. Among the countless forces that shape the world, few stood further apart than war and love. One destroys, one creates, one leaves cities burning beneath dark skies. The other inspires kingdoms to rise in the first place. And yet, throughout history, mortals would discover a strange truth. The things most opposite often move toward one another, like storms drawn toward the sea, like fire seeking air. And somewhere upon Olympus, that impossible contradiction took form. For it was there that Ares first found himself drawn toward Aphrodite. To many among the gods, Aphrodite seemed effortless. Where she walked, admiration followed naturally. Beauty surrounded her not merely as appearance, but as presence. Rooms seemed warmer around her. Silence felt lighter. Even immortals found themselves changed beneath her influence. Because beauty possesses a strange kind of power. Not the power to command, not the power to conquer, something quieter, the power to make others willingly surrender. Ares had spent ages standing apart from Olympus, watching from the edges of conversations, watching admiration gather around others, watching affection move through halls that often seemed colder in his presence. He had grown accustomed to distance, to restraint, to the invisible walls surrounding him. Then came Aphrodite, and for perhaps the first time in his existence, someone looked toward him without discomfort, without hesitation, without caution. She did not see a force to fear, did not see conflict walking in divine form. She saw Ares, and to him that difference felt enormous. No battlefield had ever unsettled him. No monster had ever inspired fear. Yet this felt unfamiliar, because rage he understood, violence he understood, loneliness he understood. But affection carried uncertainty, a kind of vulnerability battle never required. Slowly, something changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. Moments gathered quietly. Conversations stretched longer. Distances shortened. The halls of Olympus no longer felt entirely empty. For the first time, Ares felt a strange calm settle within him. Not peace. Peace implied permanence. This felt more fragile, like standing within sunlight after endless storms. And perhaps that was why he protected it so carefully, because some things become most precious to those who rarely receive them. But Olympus rarely allowed happiness to exist without complication, because Aphrodite already belonged to another. She had been joined to Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, master of fire and creation, a god whose hands shaped wonders beyond imagination. And though Olympus recognized marriages as bonds of gods, the hearts of immortals rarely moved according to order. So Ares and Aphrodite kept their closeness hidden, not because gods cannot love, because Olympus watches everything. Whispers move quickly through eternal halls, and secrets rarely remain buried forever. Still, for a time, Ares ignored this, because after endless centuries of distance, endless years spent feeling like a presence merely tolerated, something inside him had changed. The loneliness that once followed him everywhere seemed quieter, smaller. For once he was not standing at the edge of Olympus looking inward. Someone had stepped beside him, and perhaps what mattered most was not beauty, not desire, not even love itself. It was recognition, because Aphrodite had done something no battle ever could, no victory ever could, no power ever could. She made Ares feel seen, truly seen. And for a god who spent eternity embodying conflict, that feeling carried more danger than war itself. Because battle wounds the body, but hope wounds something deeper. Far below Olympus, mortals continued fighting, continued loving, continued destroying one another for reasons they barely understood. And perhaps without realizing it, they reflected the same contradiction unfolding among the gods. Because love and war had never truly stood opposed. Both inspire passion, both demand sacrifice, both change people beyond recognition, and both often leave suffering behind. High above the world, beneath endless skies, Ares allowed himself something he rarely trusted. Not rage, not strength, not power. Something infinitely more fragile, happiness. And for a little while, it felt real. Happiness among the gods was never allowed to remain untouched for long. Not because Olympus was cruel by nature, but because nothing within it could remain hidden forever. Even silence eventually becomes known. Even secrets eventually find light. And for Ares and Aphrodite, that light arrived in the most unforgiving form imaginable. Discovery. Their connection had grown quietly across Olympus, not spoken aloud, not declared, not presented before the gods, but observed, always observed, because even immortals leave patterns behind them, and patterns, once noticed, cannot be unseen. The one who first brought certainty to suspicion was Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, the maker of divine tools and impossible mechanisms. Unlike the others of Olympus, Hephaestus understood structure in a way few could. He saw what others missed. Not emotion, not intention, but design. And once he understood what was unfolding between Ares and Aphrodite, he did not react in anger. He reacted in precision. For anger is unstable, but creation is patient. He forged something unlike anything else among the gods. Not a weapon of war, but a trap for truth itself. An invisible net, a construct so fine and perfect that no eye could detect it, no strength could break it, no god could sense it before it was too late. And then he waited, patiently, quietly, until the moment came, one evening upon Olympus, when golden light softened across marble halls. Ares and Aphrodite met once again in secrecy. For a brief moment, the world felt distant. The weight of Olympus faded, and they allowed themselves what they had begun to believe might exist beyond consequence. But consequence, in divine stories, is never absent. It only delays its arrival. At the precise moment of vulnerability, the trap was released. The invisible net descended without sound, without warning, without mercy. And in an instant, both gods were caught. Ares struggled immediately. Instinct took over before thought, but the trap did not yield. It was not made for resistance. It was made for inevitability. Aphrodite froze beside him, realization unfolding slowly across her expression, and then silence fell across Olympus. Not the silence of peace, the silence of exposure. One by one, the gods arrived, drawn not by concern, but by spectacle. And when they saw what had been revealed, something unexpected happened. They did not intervene. They did not comfort. They did not condemn in seriousness. They laughed, not cruel laughter, not angry laughter, something far worse, amusement. The immortals of Olympus, beings who shaped reality itself, stood above the trapped figures of war and love and simply laughed at what they saw. Because even gods are not free from fascination when seeing contradiction laid bare. Ares, the embodiment of violence. Aphrodite, the embodiment of desire, caught together beneath the perfection of a craftsman's design, exposed, still, helpless. And in that moment, something within Ares fractured, not physically, but in a place far deeper, because war had never humiliated him, battle had never broken him. Even defeat in war still carries meaning. But this was not defeat. This was exposure. The stripping away of dignity without conflict, power without expression, strength rendered irrelevant. He looked upon Olympus watching him, laughing, observing, remembering. And for the first time, Ares understood something unbearable. He was not feared in the way he thought. He was not respected in the way he believed. He was something else entirely. He was watched, as if his existence itself were part of something to be observed rather than honored. And beside him stood Aphrodite, not distant, not divine in the way Olympus preferred, but real, vulnerable, and trapped within the same gaze. The moment stretched endlessly, until even laughter began to fade into silence. Eventually, the gods dispersed, one by one returning to their halls, leaving behind only stillness, and the trapped figures remained, until release came later through negotiation and arrangement among the gods. But something had already changed, because even after freedom returns, memory does not. And Ares carried that moment with him, not as rage, not as vengeance, but as realization that Olympus did not always oppose him. Sometimes it simply watched him, and watching can wound just as deeply as war. Some punishments are not designed to destroy a body. They are designed to erase movement itself, to remove action, to suspend existence in a space where even time feels irrelevant. For Ares, that punishment came not from Olympus, but from the edges of myth itself. It began with arrogance, not his own, but the arrogance of beings who believed even gods could be captured if the right conditions were met. These were the Aloidae, the giant sons of Poseidon, beings who grew in power and ambition until they began to believe even Olympus could be challenged. And in their rising madness, they turned their attention toward war itself, toward the god who embodied it, Ares. Unlike the careful designs of Hephaestus or the silent humiliation of Olympus's laughter, this was something different. This was force meeting force. The giants did not trap Ares through subtlety. They overwhelmed him through sheer strength and deception combined. And for the first time, the god of war found himself unable to respond in the way he had always relied upon. Instinct failed when there was no space to act. Rage failed when there was no direction for it to go. Even divine strength becomes meaningless when movement itself is denied. And so Ares was bound, imprisoned within a bronze vessel, a sealed chamber of metal and silence, not a cage in the mortal sense, something worse, a space without possibility. Inside it, there was no battlefield, no enemy to strike, no horizon to charge toward, only confinement and stillness. In myths that survived through ages, it is said that Ares remained trapped for an entire year. But within such a place, time loses meaning. Days do not feel like days. They become repetition. Thoughts looping endlessly within confined space. For a god defined by motion, conflict, and force, this was not simply imprisonment. It was contradiction made physical, war without war, power without expression, violence without release. Outside the bronze prison, the world continued without him. Olympus did not fall. Mortals did not stop fighting. Conflict did not pause in his absence. And perhaps that realization was its own kind of wound, because even the god of war is not required for war to exist. War does not belong to him. He belongs to war. Eventually, it was Hermes who intervened, the messenger god, swift, elusive, the one who moves between worlds without resistance. He arrived not through battle, but through negotiation and cunning. And where strength had failed, movement succeeded. The bronze prison was opened. Ares was freed. But freedom, after absolute confinement, is not immediate restoration. It is adjustment, re-entry into a world that no longer feels familiar. When Ares finally returned to Olympus, he was unchanged in form, but something within him had shifted. Imprisonment had revealed a truth no battlefield ever had, that even war can be stopped, not defeated, not destroyed, simply contained. And that realization lingered in him longer than any wound ever could. Because wounds heal, but understanding remains. After his release, Ares moved differently, not weaker, not broken, but quieter, as though part of him had learned what it meant to exist without force, to be present without action, to endure without response. And somewhere deep within him, something began to form. Not rage, not humiliation, something colder, reflection. Because for the first time, he had experienced what it meant to be removed from the world he defined. And he understood, in a way no god of Olympus truly wished to understand, that even violence can be silenced, not by greater violence, but by absence of opportunity. And that absence changed him more than any war ever had. When conflict returned to the world in its greatest recorded form, it was not small, it was not personal, it was not contained to a single battlefield or kingdom. It was total. The Trojan War became the stage where gods and mortals collided, where fate and ambition intertwined so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. And in that chaos, Ares did what he had always done. He returned to war, not as observer, not as symbol, but as presence. On opposite sides of the conflict, the gods chose alignment based on preference, pride, and old rivalries. Some supported Troy, some supported Greece, but none remained truly neutral, because war, once large enough, consumes even the idea of distance. At first, Ares moved through the battlefield as he always had, He was not strategy. That belonged to Athena. He was momentum. He was impact. He was the moment when formations collapse and discipline breaks into instinct, where Athena brought structure to combat. Ares brought collapse to structure. On the plains of Troy, mortals clashed beneath skies filled with divine attention. Spears shattered, shields cracked. Dust rose like smoke across endless fields. And in that chaos, Ares felt something familiar. Not peace, not satisfaction, recognition. Because here, finally, he was not questioned, not distanced, not quietly set apart. Here, war was allowed to be itself, unfiltered, uncontrolled, and Ares moved within it like something returning home. But even war has limits. Even chaos meets resistance. And in the midst of the Trojan conflict, Ares discovered something he had not fully understood before. Mortals were fragile, not just physically, but existentially. They broke quickly. They endured briefly. And they died with emotions unfinished. Fear, anger, confusion, love, all unresolved in a single instant. And Ares witnessed it repeatedly, again and again, until even his nature began to feel heavier, not because he lacked strength, but because he saw consequence without distance. Unlike Olympus, where violence is observed from above, here, violence was immediate, close, inescapable. At one point during the war, Ares entered direct conflict with mortals empowered by divine favor. And for the first time in myth, the god of war was wounded. Not symbolically, not indirectly, but truly struck. Pain for an immortal is not simply physical sensation. It is interruption, a break in certainty. And Ares recoiled, not from fear, but from realization that even he was not separate from the destruction he embodied. Across the battlefield, Athena stood not as chaos, but as control. Where Ares surged, she directed. Where he broke formations, she restored them. And in that contrast, the war itself seemed to take shape as something almost philosophical. Not just conflict between mortals, but conflict between interpretations of conflict itself. Rage versus reason, impulse versus strategy, destruction versus order. And neither could fully erase the other, because war, in its deepest form, contains both. As the Trojan War stretched onward, Ares no longer experienced it as pure instinct. He began to see patterns, consequences, the way each victory created future loss, the way every moment of triumph carried unseen cost. And slowly, something within him shifted again, not toward peace, but toward understanding. because even the god of war eventually learns that war does not exist in isolation. It spreads, it echoes, it remains long after battlefields are empty. And as he stood above the chaos of Troy, watching mortals fight beneath divine indifference, Ares began to understand something that Olympus had never taught him. War is not just force, it is accumulation of choices, of emotions, of inevitability, and perhaps for the first time, he did not feel only as its god, but as its witness. After the war, there is never silence, only distance from the sound. The Trojan War had ended in the eyes of mortals, but nothing truly ends when so much has been destroyed. Cities rebuild, names are forgotten, songs are rewritten, but something always remains beneath it all. Memory. And for Ares, memory was heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He no longer moved through war as he once did, not as pure impulse, not as uncontrollable force. Something in him had changed. The battlefield no longer felt like home, but it also did not feel foreign. It felt understood. For the first time, Ares saw war not as something separate from existence, but as something woven into it. Because everywhere life expands, conflict follows. Where there is desire, there is opposition. Where there is power, there is resistance. Where there is love, there is loss waiting to happen. And Ares realized something he had never been allowed to understand in Olympus. War was not just destruction, it was consequence, not random, not meaningless, but unavoidable. Even the gods who judged him most harshly had never escaped it. Zeus ruled through victories born from conflict. Athena guided wars that still ended in blood. Even peace itself had been built upon battles that came before it. And yet Ares alone was made to carry its weight, to be named as if he were its only source. Far below Olympus, mortals continued their cycles, building, destroying, rebuilding again. They prayed for peace while preparing for war. They condemned violence while creating the conditions for it. And Ares watched them not with anger, but with understanding, because he had finally seen what Olympus never taught him. War was not chosen by one god. It was produced by existence itself. Still, understanding did not bring comfort. It brought clarity, and clarity is not gentle. It simply removes illusion. There was no place where Ares could disappear, no version of reality where conflict would never exist, because even in moments of peace, the possibility of its breaking always remained, and that possibility carried his presence with it, not as punishment, not as praise, but as inevitability. Ares did not stand above war. He did not control it. He did not define it. He was simply what appeared when everything else reached its limit. And perhaps that was the truth Olympus never wanted to face. Not that Ares was cruel, not that he was unnecessary, but that he was unavoidable. As ages passed, stories of him would be told differently. Some would call him violent, some would call him cursed, some would call him necessary, but none of them would agree, because Ares was never a simple god. He was a reflection of what gods and mortals both refused to fully accept about themselves. That beneath order, beneath love, beneath civilization itself, there is always something older, something waiting, something that returns whenever restraint fails, and in the end, Ares remains, not as triumph, not as defeat, but as what has always existed beneath everything else. The quiet truth of conflict, the god of what remains when everything breaks.